January 14, 1945. 22:47 hours. Somewhere over the Lingayen Gulf, Philippine Islands. The tropical night hung thick and black above the water, the kind of darkness that swallows stars and turns the horizon into nothing more than a suggestion. Below, the phosphorescent wake of American supply ships traced pale lines across obsidian waves, each vessel a lifeline carrying ammunition, rations, and hope to MacArthur's forces pushing inland. The air tasted of salt and aviation fuel, that peculiar cocktail of the Pacific War that clung to everything: clothing, skin, memory. On the deck of the escort carrier USS Natoma Bay, a young sailor paused between loading operations to light a cigarette, cupping the flame against the wind. He glanced upward into that consuming void and wondered, as so many did in those hours, what moved unseen in the darkness above. 3,000 feet higher, suspended in that same blackness, Captain James W. Bradford sat in the left seat of a Northrop P-61 Black Widow, call sign Midnight Rider. The aircraft was enormous for a fighter, a twin-boom monster weighing nearly 30,000 pounds fully loaded, painted in a matte black that seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflect it. Bradford's hands rested lightly on the yoke, his eyes scanning instruments that glowed a dull red in the cockpit, red light that preserved night vision, that allowed a pilot to read altitude and airspeed without surrendering his ability to see into the dark. Behind him, separated by a bulkhead, radar operator Lieutenant Robert Graham hunched over his SCR-720 radar scope, watching green phosphorescent blips paint themselves across the circular screen with each sweep of the antenna. The radar dish, mounted in the aircraft's nose, reached invisibly into the night, touching things the human eye could never see. They had been airborne for nearly an hour on what the brass called a combat air patrol, a CAP mission, circling endlessly above the invasion fleet like a patient hawk. The other pilots, the ones who flew Corsairs and Hellcats in daylight, had made their jokes. They always did. The P-61 was too big, too slow, too strange with its twin booms and its radar equipment, and its crew of 3 men where a proper fighter needed only 1. It looked like something drawn by a committee, they said, like something that couldn't decide whether it was a bomber or a fighter or some ungainly hybrid of both. In the ready rooms and mess halls, the day fighters called it the pregnant whale and the flying boxcar, and they laughed when the Black Widow crews walked. Bradford had heard all the jokes. He'd smiled politely, said nothing, and climbed into his cockpit night after night while those same pilots slept. Because what the day fighters didn't understand, what they couldn't understand until they'd sat in complete darkness 3 miles above a hostile ocean, was that the night belonged to a different kind of war entirely. The evolution of aerial combat in the Second World War had followed a trajectory that few military theorists of the 1930s could have predicted. When the war began in Europe in September 1939, fighter aircraft were instruments of daylight supremacy. Nimble, single-engine machines designed to dogfight in clear skies where pilots could see their enemies and maneuver accordingly. The very language of air combat was visual. Tally-ho meant you'd spotted the enemy. Check 6 meant look behind you. Break right meant turn sharply before the guns found you. It was a war of eyeballs and instinct, of split-second judgments made at 300 miles per hour. But war, like water, flows into every available space. When daylight bombing proved too costly, the bombers came at night. When fighters couldn't find them in the darkness, the bombers came in greater numbers. The Germans discovered this first during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, when RAF night fighters equipped with primitive airborne radar began shooting down Luftwaffe bombers over England. The technology was crude. The early sets could detect an aircraft at perhaps 4 miles, and interpreting the scope required a specialist operator who did nothing else. But crude or not, it worked. British night fighters like the Bristol Beaufighter and the de Havilland Mosquito began extracting a toll that German bomber crews couldn't understand and couldn't avoid. They were being killed by an enemy they never saw, by fighters that appeared without warning in the darkness and opened fire from distances so close that evasion was impossible. The Americans, joining the war late, observed and learned. In 1940, Northrop Aircraft began designing what would become the P-61, the first American aircraft conceived from the outset as a radar-equipped night fighter. The design was radical, a twin-engine, twin-boom configuration that placed the radar operator and gunner in separate positions, that mounted 4 20 cannons in the belly and 4 50 caliber machine guns in a dorsal turret. It was large because radar equipment in 1940 was large, because night fighting required endurance to patrol for hours, because hitting a target at night demanded firepower heavy enough to guarantee destruction on the first pass. There would be no second chances in the dark. The first P-61s reached operational squadrons in the Pacific in mid-1944, and from the beginning they were misunderstood. Fighter pilots, trained in the tradition of dogfighting and visual combat, looked at the Black Widow's size and shook their heads. It seemed to violate every principle they'd learned. It was too heavy to turn with a zero, too large to hide, too complex with its 3-man crew and its electronics and its specialized mission. In the daylight culture of fighter aviation, it was an aberration. But Captain Bradford, flying through the Philippine night in January 1945, understood what others did not. The P-61 wasn't designed to fight like a day fighter. It was designed to do something day fighters couldn't do at all. The Japanese had expected many things when they'd launched their war of conquest across the Pacific in December 1941, but American technological adaptation had not been among them. Japanese naval aviation in 1941 had been the finest in the world. Their pilots were supremely trained, their tactics refined through years of combat in China, their aircraft like the Zero fighter and the Betty bomber optimized for the ranges and conditions of Pacific warfare. They had expected to fight American pilots who were soft, American aircraft that were inferior, American resolve that would crumble after a few sharp defeats. Instead, they encountered an industrial democracy that absorbed the initial blows and responded with a production capacity that beggared imagination. American shipyards that had built passenger liners began launching aircraft carriers at a rate of 1 per month. Aircraft factories that had produced a few hundred planes per year began producing 1,000 per month, then more. And more strangely, more unsettlingly, the Americans seemed to approach war as an engineering problem to be solved through technology and systematic innovation. Every defeat became data. Every tactical challenge received a technological response. The Japanese had supremacy at night. The Americans built radar. Japanese torpedoes were superior. The Americans analyzed captured examples and redesigned their own. Japanese pilots were better trained. The Americans shortened the learning curve with better training programs, better aircraft, and, crucially, an industrial base that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. By January 1945, the Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Service were shadows of their former selves. The cream of their pre-war pilot corps was dead, shot down over the Solomons, over New Guinea, over the Philippines in the great carrier battles. Their replacement pilots received perhaps 1/10 the training time of their American counterparts. Aviation fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer still. Their aircraft industry, hammered by American bombing and strangled by submarine blockade, produced ever fewer aircraft of increasing obsolescence. Where once they had attacked in formations of dozens, now they came in ones and twos, flying missions that were often one way by design, if not by intention. But still they came. Desperation has its own kind of courage. At 23:14 hours, Lieutenant Graham's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and professional despite what he was seeing. "Pilot, I have multiple contacts. Bearing 350, range 12 miles, altitude Angels 8, heading southeast. Count 4 distinct targets. Bradford felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. Roger, any IFF. Negative, no identification, friend or foe signal. They're not ours. By January 1945, the Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Service were shadows of their former selves. The cream of their pre-war pilot corps was dead, shot down over the Solomons, over New Guinea, over the Philippines in the great carrier battles. Their replacement pilots received perhaps a tenth the training time of their American counterparts. Aviation fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer still. Their aircraft industry, hammered by American bombing and strangled by submarine blockade, produced ever fewer aircraft of increasing obsolescence. Where once they had attacked in formations of dozens, now they came in ones and twos, flying missions that were often one way by design, if not by intention. But still they came. Desperation has its own kind of courage. At 23:14 hours, Lieutenant Graham's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and professional despite what he was seeing. Pilot, I have multiple contacts. Bearing 350, range 12 miles, altitude Angels 8, heading southeast. Count 4 distinct targets. Bradford felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. Roger, any IFF. Negative, no identification, friend or foe signal. They're not ours. And this was the terrible beauty of radar-directed night fighting. The thing that the Japanese bomber crews could not have understood even if someone had explained it to them in detail. They were flying through the night sky believing themselves invisible, protected by darkness that had shielded night bombers since the First World War. They navigated by stars and compass, maintaining formation by watching the dim blue exhaust flames of their neighbors' engines. They watched for searchlights, for the muzzle flash of anti-aircraft guns, for the telltale silhouette of an enemy fighter framed against a lighter patch of sky. These were the dangers they knew. They did not know that 40 miles away, an American radar station on the ground had detected them the moment they crossed the coastline. They did not know that a controller in a darkened room had vectored a Black Widow toward their flight path, guiding it like a chess piece to the perfect interception point. They did not know that at this moment, invisible in the darkness 2,000 feet below them, an aircraft was climbing toward them with every advantage. Position, surprise, weapons ready, and most critically, information. The Americans knew exactly where the Japanese were. The Japanese didn't. This information asymmetry represented something profoundly new in the history of warfare, and it challenged assumptions that had held since men first fought one another with sharpened stones. Throughout human history, the primary tactical advantage had belonged to the defender who could see the attacker coming, the castle on the hill, the army holding the high ground, the picket line that spotted the enemy advance. Darkness and weather had always favored the attacker who could use concealment to achieve surprise, but radar inverted this ancient equation. Now the defender could see through darkness, through clouds, through conditions that rendered the human eye useless. The attacker's concealment became his weakness. The more invisible he thought himself, the more vulnerable he actually was. The Japanese, products of a military culture that emphasized spirit over materiel, courage over technology, the warrior's heart over the engineer's calculation, struggled to accept what this meant. Their doctrine had been forged in an era when one pilot's bravery and skill could offset technological disadvantage, when individual excellence could defeat superior numbers or equipment. But radar-directed night interception wasn't something that could be defeated by courage. You couldn't fly an enemy who knew your position while you range 3 miles, Graham said. His voice remained level, but Bradford could hear the tension beneath it, the focus of a man staring at a scope while calculating closure rates and interception angles in his head. Targets in close formation, bearing steady. Bradford eased back on the yoke, climbing now, positioning the Black Widow slightly below and behind the formation. The night fighters' tactical doctrine was explicit. Approach from below where the enemy's blind spot was largest, close to minimum range, ideally 500 feet or less, and fire a burst concentrated enough to destroy the target before it could react. The P-61's 420 cannons, each firing explosive shells at a rate of 650 rounds per minute, could saw an aircraft in half in 2 seconds. But only if you got close enough. Only if your first burst counted. 1 mile, Graham said, target still unaware. Bradford's eyes strained into the darkness ahead. Nothing. The night was absolute, a wall of black that revealed nothing. He was flying toward targets he couldn't see, guided by instruments and by the calm voice of a man reading ghost images on a phosphorescent screen. Half mile. Steady. Steady. And then, there, the faintest suggestion of something darker against the dark, 4 shapes barely distinguishable from the void around them. Bradford's mind processed the silhouettes automatically. Twin-engine bombers, probably Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers based on the profile, flying in a loose 4-ship formation. Each bomber carried a crew of 7 men. Each aircraft was loaded with bombs or torpedoes intended for the American ships below, and none of them had any idea that death was overtaking them at a closing speed of 100 miles per hour. The G4M Betty had been, in 1941, one of the finest medium bombers in the world, fast, long-ranged, capable of carrying a ton of ordnance across vast stretches of the Pacific. But the Americans had quickly given it another nickname, the Flying Zippo, because it burned so readily when hit. Japanese designers, obsessed with range and speed, had sacrificed crew protection and fuel tank armor. A bomber that could fly 3,000 miles was of little use if it exploded after a single burst of machine gun fire. By 1945, Betty crews knew they flew coffins. They flew anyway. Bradford closed to 400 feet, directly astern of the trailing aircraft. At this distance he could see the bomber clearly now, the distinctive cigar-shaped fuselage, the high-mounted wings, the twin radial engines, one on each wing, their exhausts glowing dull red in the darkness. He could see the rear defensive position, where a gunner sat behind a 20 cannon, scanning the darkness behind his aircraft for threats he was trained to recognize. The silhouette of a fighter, the flash of gunfire, the suddenly closer shape of an attacker. But the Black Widow approached in complete darkness, making no sound that could be heard over the Betty's own engines, presenting no visual signature the gunner could detect. Bradford thumbed the firing stud on his control yoke. The airframe shuddered as 4 20 cannons opened fire simultaneously, a 2-second burst that sent perhaps 20 explosive shells into the bomber's fuselage, and wings at a range so close that every round hit. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Betty's right wing erupted in flame as the fuel tanks, those unarmored, overloaded fuel tanks, ignited. The bomber rolled right, trailing fire, and began the long fall toward the ocean 3,000 feet. Bradford didn't watch it fall. He was already tracking left, seeking the second aircraft. Target destroyed, Graham confirmed unnecessarily. Second target bearing 345, range 600 feet. The second Betty's crew had perhaps 5 seconds of warning, time enough to see their companion explode in flame, time enough for the realization that something was attacking from the darkness, not nearly enough time to react. Bradford closed to 300 feet and fired again. Another 2-second burst, another 20 explosive shells, another bomber transformed instantly from aircraft to torch. This one disintegrated rather than fell, coming apart in midair as its bomb load cooked off in the flames. Targets 3 and 4 breaking formation, Graham reported. Grace works a 12-hour shift today. She will earn holiday pay, which she needs. She is 34. She has 2 sons. She is Hidatsa, enrolled with the Fort Belknap Indian community, descended from people who lived along the Missouri River for centuries before the reservations, before the treaties, before the imposition of a legal system that designated her ancestors as domestic dependents, and then as citizens, and then as participants in a democracy that has never fully reckoned with its foundational extractions. Grace does not think about this history while she works. She thinks about her residents, about their dignity, about the small mercies she can offer, a kind word, a warmed blanket. She eats her own lunch in the staff break room, a space that smells of microwaved food and industrial cleaner. She eats a turkey sandwich she brought from home, the turkey sliced thin from a deli loaf, processed and packaged, purchased on sale. She eats a protein bar for dessert, the same brand that Sandra Acoy and David Tran and Rosa Delgado have encountered in their separate orbits. It costs 99 cents at the grocery store where Grace shops. It is marked as a healthy option, as fuel, as the convenient choice for people who work long hours and do not have time to prepare elaborate meals. She does not taste it, particularly. She eats it because she is hungry, because her shift is only half over, because she needs the cash. But there were no clouds, and the Black Widow had endurance the bomber couldn't match. Bradford advanced his throttles and settled into pursuit, climbing after the fleeing bomber in a stern chase that would have been impossible without radar. The Betty was invisible now, lost in the darkness above and ahead, but Graham's calm voice provided all the information Bradford needed: bearing, range, altitude, and rate of change. They climbed for 3 minutes, trading speed for altitude, the two aircraft spiraling upward through the night like moths around an invisible flame. At 12,000 feet, Bradford closed to firing range, 500 feet, dead astern, perfectly positioned. The Betty's rear gunner opened fire first, perhaps seeing the Black Widow's exhaust flames, or perhaps simply firing at where his instincts told him an attacker should be. Tracers arced into the night, green phosphorescent lines that passed wide of the American fighter. Bradford centered the illuminated gunsight reticle on the bomber's fuselage and fired his final burst. 4 streams of cannon shells converged on the Betty, and for perhaps 2 seconds nothing seemed to happen, and then the entire aircraft exploded in a fireball so bright that Bradford instinctively flinched, his night vision destroyed by the flash. The Betty simply ceased to exist, transforming from aircraft to expanding cloud of burning debris in less time than it takes to draw breath. From first contact to final kill, 83 minutes had elapsed. 4 bombers destroyed, 28 Japanese airmen dead. 1 Black Widow expended less than 300 rounds of ammunition. Bradford turned the P-61 southeast and began the long descent back to the carrier patrol altitude, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. Below, the American fleet continued its operations, unaware and unthreatened. The 4 bombs that would have fallen on transport ships, on destroyers, on the escort carriers, they rested now at the bottom of the Lingayen Gulf, still secured in the bomb bays of aircraft that had become coffins before they became wrecks. Bradford's radio crackled with the voice of the combat information officer aboard the fleet flagship. "Midnight Rider, Mother Base. Confirm 4 splashes." "Confirmed," Bradford replied. 4 bandits destroyed." "Outstanding work, Rider." "Return to station." "Outstanding work." As if it had been difficult, as if the outcome had ever been in doubt once the radar had detected them. In the daylight hours that followed, the story spread through the fleet with the speed that only military gossip can achieve. 4 bombers destroyed in one night. 4 kills by a single aircraft. The day fighter pilots who had made their jokes about the Black Widow heard the numbers and reassessed their humor. Some remained skeptical. Night fighting was a different kind of warfare, they said, not real dogfighting, more like shooting fish in a barrel. But others, the ones who thought more deeply about what they were hearing, began to understand that they were witnessing something historically significant. The P-61 Black Widow crews, for their part, said little. They flew their missions night after night, patrolling in darkness while the fleet slept below them, occasionally reporting a splash, occasionally returning without firing a shot. They didn't boast in the ready rooms. They didn't swagger in the mess lines. They understood that what they did was not glory in the traditional sense. There was no swirling dogfight, no aerobatic brilliance, no moment when individual pilot skill triumphed over odds. There was only the patient work of radar operators and the mechanical execution of interception geometry. But efficiency was its own kind of revolution, and the numbers told a story that transcended individual narratives of courage or skill. In the first 3 months of 1945, as the Philippines campaign ground toward its conclusion, P-61 Black Widows shot down more than 70 Japanese aircraft at night with a loss rate that approached zero. The Japanese simply couldn't develop effective countermeasures. Their aircraft lacked radar warning receivers. Their tactics, developed in an era when darkness guaranteed concealment, became death traps in an era when radar made darkness transparent. Their pilots flew into battle-carrying assumptions that had been rendered obsolete by technology they didn't possess and couldn't counter. For the Japanese bomber crews, the psychological effect was more corrosive than the physical losses. In daylight combat, when you were shot down, you at least saw your killer. You could understand what had happened. You'd been outflown, or outnumbered, or surprised, or simply unlucky. The defeat had a shape, a narrative, an enemy face you could hate or respect. But to be destroyed at night without warning, without ever seeing your attacker, without any opportunity to fight back or even to understand what was happening, this was a different kind of death. It suggested an enemy who fought without honor, who killed from a position of such superiority that the contest ceased to be. Of course, this interpretation revealed more about Japanese military culture than about American intentions. The Americans weren't trying to be dishonorable, they were trying to be effective. The distinction between the two perspectives, between warfare as a contest of spirit and warfare as a problem to be solved, captured much of what made the Pacific War so existentially different from the Japanese perspective than from the American one. To a Japanese officer trained in the Bushido tradition, war was ultimately about the cultivation and demonstration of correct spirit. Technology was useful, but it was secondary to the warrior's heart. A Japanese pilot who died courageously in hopeless battle had achieved something meaningful, something that transcended mere tactical success or failure. The act of To an American engineer, this philosophy was incomprehensible. War was something to be won as quickly and efficiently as possible so that normal life could resume. Technology wasn't secondary, it was primary. It was the application of intelligence and resources to solve the problem of enemy resistance. A battle won without risk to your own forces wasn't dishonorable, it was ideal. Why would you fight fairly when you could fight effectively? Why would you prioritize abstract concepts like spirit when concrete advantages like radar existed? The Black Widow pilots understood this difference, even if they couldn't always articulate it clearly. They flew a machine that embodied American abundance and American engineering philosophy. The P-61 was overbuilt, over-engineered, loaded with redundant systems and backup equipment. It carried enough fuel for 6 hours of patrol. Its radios could communicate over hundreds of miles. Its radar, constantly refined and improved through feedback from operational squadrons, could track targets with increasing precision. The aircraft was maintained by trained specialists who had access to vast stores of spare parts, who consulted detailed technical manuals, who could replace an entire engine if necessary, rather than trying to patch together. Everything about the Black Widow contrasted with the desperate measures that characterized late-war Japanese aviation. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that were increasingly cobbled together from salvaged parts, running on fuel of declining quality, maintained by mechanics who lacked proper tools and training. Japanese bombers attacked without fighter escort because there weren't enough fighters. Japanese missions were one way not by ideological choice, but by practical necessity. There simply wasn't enough fuel for a round trip. The abundance differential wasn't subtle. It wasn't a matter of minor advantages in specific areas. It was comprehensive, overwhelming, visible in every aspect of operations. American fleet carriers operated with hot meals for their crews, with ice cream machines, with mail delivery, with movie screenings during off-duty hours. American pilots who were shot down and rescued could expect to return to their squadrons within days. American aircraft that were damaged could be replaced within hours. American technological problems, like the early unreliability of the P-61's dorsal turret, were identified, studied, and fixed through systematic engineering rather than being accepted as inevitable. This abundance was itself a weapon, perhaps the ultimate weapon, though it wore no uniform and fired no shots. It created a material reality that made certain outcomes inevitable regardless of individual courage or tactical brilliance. A Japanese pilot, no matter how skilled or determined, eventually ran out of fuel and fell into the ocean. An American pilot who ran low on fuel simply radioed his carrier and received vectors to the nearest available landing deck, where he'd be recovered, refueled, and sent back into action. A Japanese squadron that lost half its aircraft in combat became combat ineffective. An American squadron that lost half its aircraft received replacements within a week and continued operations. From this perspective, Captain Bradford's 83 minutes of night fighting over the Lingayen Gulf represented something larger than 4 kills or even 4 prevented attacks on the fleet. It represented the intersection of American industrial capacity, American technological innovation, and American tactical doctrine into a system that Japanese forces couldn't match or counter. The Black Widow itself was an artifact of abundance, an aircraft that required radar, specialized training, a 3-man crew, complex maintenance, and patience with early technical problems. No nation fighting desperately for survival could afford to develop such a weapon. Only a nation with resources to spare, with the luxury of solving problems systematically rather than improvising desperately, could create aircraft like the P-61. The 4 Japanese bomber crews who died that night had been brave men flying a desperate mission in an increasingly hopeless war. They'd taken off knowing the odds against them, knowing that American radar and night fighters prowled the skies, knowing that their chances of returning were slim. They'd flown anyway because their culture and their training and their orders demanded it. There was courage in that choice, even if the mission itself was tactically questionable. But courage, in the end, couldn't defeat radar. Spirit couldn't overcome industrial capacity. Determination couldn't compensate for fuel shortages and inadequate training and aircraft worn beyond their service limits. The mathematics of attrition warfare are brutally simple. Whoever can absorb losses and replace them wins. Whoever runs out of aircraft or fuel or pilots first loses. By early 1945, Japan had long since lost that mathematical contest, though its leaders refused to acknowledge the fact. The empire's industries produced fewer than 1,000 aircraft per month. The United States produced more than 9,000. Japanese oil production, strangled by submarine warfare, had collapsed to perhaps 10% of wartime requirements. American oil production exceeded all military and civilian needs combined. Japanese pilot training programs, devastated by losses and fuel shortages, produced pilots with perhaps 60 hours of flight time. American programs produced pilots with more than 300 hours, plus specialized training in gunnery, tactics, and combat procedures. The Black Widow and its radar were simply the technological manifestation of this larger reality. They represented what happened when a wealthy industrial democracy decided to apply its full capabilities to solving military problems. The aircraft was expensive, perhaps 10 times the cost of a single-engine day fighter. The radar was complex and required specialist operators. The entire night fighter program demanded infrastructure, ground-based radar stations, trained controllers, specialized maintenance, dedicated spare parts pipelines. But the United States could afford all of it and barely notice the expense. Japan, by contrast, could barely afford to keep its existing forces flying. Every aircraft lost was irreplaceable. Every pilot killed created a gap that couldn't be filled. Every gallon of aviation fuel burned was a gallon less for the next mission. The empire was bleeding to death by increments, and no amount of courage or spiritual cultivation could staunch the wounds. Bradford landed the Black Widow aboard USS Sedor at 01:30 hours, the carrier's deck crew guiding the big fighter down onto the heaving deck with practiced efficiency. As he climbed from the cockpit, legs stiff from hours in the cramped seat, the mechanic nodded, made a note on his clipboard, and began his post-flight inspection. To him, the Black Widow was a machine to be maintained, no different in principle from the Hellcats and Avengers that crowded the carrier's deck. He'd check oil levels, inspect hydraulic lines, verify that the cannon barrels showed acceptable wear, refuel the tanks, rearm the magazines. If everything was satisfactory, the aircraft would be ready for the next night's mission. If not, he'd fix whatever needed fixing. The work was routine, methodical, unromantic, and that, in the end, was the point. The Americans had systematized warfare, reduced it to procedures and checklists and engineering tolerances. They'd taken the individual heroism out of it as much as possible, not because they opposed heroism, but because reliable systems worked better than relying on heroes. The Black Widow crew didn't need to be aces. They needed to be competent professionals who followed proven procedures. The radar operator didn't need supernatural instincts. He needed to interpret his scope correctly and communicate clearly. The pilot didn't need to be a gifted dogfighter. He needed to fly stable intercept courses and shoot accurately at close range. This procedural approach to warfare offended traditional military sensibilities, Japanese and sometimes American alike. Where was the individual glory? Where was the recognition of exceptional talent? Where was the warrior's path to immortality through magnificent deeds? The answer, unsatisfying to anyone raised on martial traditions, was that such things were secondary. They were nice if they happened, but they weren't necessary. What was necessary was sinking the enemy bombers before they hit the fleet. In the decades after the war, military historians would analyze the Pacific Campaign with increasing sophistication, developing theories about industrial warfare and technological determinism, and the revolution in military affairs. They would note that Japan's defeat had been mathematically inevitable from the moment the United States committed to victory, that no amount of tactical brilliance or operational art could overcome the resource differential. They would point to battles like Midway or Leyte Gulf, to campaigns like the Solomons or the Philippines, as proof that material superiority, when wielded competently, defeated spiritual fervor every time. But these analyses, while accurate, somehow missed the human texture of what that material superiority meant in practice. It meant the relief that flooded through Captain Bradford's chest when his radar operator calmly announced he had contacts, because the technology worked and they weren't hunting blind. It meant the confidence to close to point-blank range, because the cannon ammunition was plentiful and the maintenance was reliable, and if something broke, there were mechanics and spare parts to fix it. It meant the fundamental assumption, so deeply embedded that American forces barely noticed it, that someone somewhere had thought through the problems and provided solutions. For the Japanese bomber crews, the inverse was true. It meant taking off on missions where successful arrival at the target was unlikely and return was impossible. It meant flying aircraft held together by salvaged parts and improvisation. It meant attacking fleets protected by radar screens and night fighters, while you navigated by compass and dead reckoning. It meant dying without ever seeing what killed you, because the enemy possessed capabilities you couldn't. On the night of January 14, 1945, 4 Japanese bombers carrying 28 men vanished into the darkness over the Lingayen Gulf and never came back. Their squadrons marked them as missing. Their families eventually received terse notifications of death in combat. Their names were inscribed on memorial stones in Japan. To the vast machinery of the Pacific War, they were a rounding error. 4 more losses in a campaign that consumed aircraft and lives by the thousands. But those 28 men had names and histories and fears and hopes. Some were veterans who'd flown since the war's beginning. Some were teenagers barely out of training. Some were married. Some had children they'd never see grow up. They'd climbed into their aircraft that evening knowing the odds, accepting them because acceptance was all their culture and their moment allowed. They'd done their duty as they understood it, and they died in darkness, atomized by cannon shells fired from an enemy they never knew was there. There's no romance in that death, no glory, no cinematic moment of courage under fire. Just radar and cannon shells, and the phosphorescent streak of a bomber burning as it fell into the ocean. Just the vast, impersonal machinery of industrial warfare grinding through its calculations. Just the terrible. The Black Widow returned to patrol altitude and continued its mission, circling through the darkness above the fleet, its radar sweeping endlessly across the night sky, seeing things human eyes could never see. The aircraft was ugly and ungainly and completely unheroic in appearance. It looked like something built by committee, by engineers who cared more about function than form. It embodied no martial tradition, inspired no songs, generated no legends of individual glory. But it worked. Night after night,